Hello and welcome back. This is part two of Should You Always Help? I'm the author narrator. Before we get started, I wanted to say a quick thank you to everybody who listened to and commented on or reached out to me personally regarding the first part. All the feedback was really appreciated and frankly very heartwarming. This was the first time I've done a project like this, and it really got me excited to do a part two. Before we get launched into the second part, I wanted to give a little bit of recap on part one and let you know that parts two and three are definitely going to be significantly longer than the first part. Shouldn't be too crazy, but we'll see when it's all ironed out, shouldn't we? For that recap, in part one, we met our heroine Rachel, who was being harried through, well, some sort of spooky setting, shall we say, by, well, something, and she was rescued by a mysterious stranger. They were able to momentarily escape from their pursuer, and now it's finally their turn to act. So, without any further ado, this is part two of Should You Always Help? Enjoy. Rachel's blood began rushing in her ears again as she stepped into the hallway. She was anxiously aware that what the stranger called her could be anywhere. The tension was almost worse than being actively chased. Almost. And it wasn't like the nearly impenetrable darkness was helping her nerves. There may be light filtering through the shuttered and boarded windows, but really that was only in comparison to the pitch darkness of whatever room Rachel had just hidden in. The few beams squeezing through were practically worthless. The hallway was on the second floor. All of the light was angled almost straight up into the ceiling. It certainly didn't help her see anything. And if she happened to look straight into it, her eyes would have to adjust all over again. Rachel pressed herself against the wall and took a moment, straining her eyes, peering into the gloom and listening for the telltale heavy footfalls or rustling fabric that would give away the presence of her. Rachel would have to ask what that title was all about as soon as she could. First, though, sticking to the wall far from the faint light and moving as quietly as possible, she started down the hallway. After a few cautious steps, Rachel looked behind her. Through the darkness, she thought she barely caught a glimpse of her friend. Continuing on her way, Rachel whispered to her companion in an attempt to calm her nerves. In my defense, I didn't plan to run upstairs. I walk by this old office building every day to and from work. So when I hear someone call for help one random night, can you blame me for coming to their aid? Rachel's whisper was getting louder as her frustration bled through. How was I to know that some thing would cut me off from the door? Hell, I would have dressed more for the gym if I had known what was in store. And why the hell are you here? Her voice could only generously be called a whisper anymore. It felt good to get that off her chest, though. Are you done with that? We are supposed to be sneaking out unnoticed, remember? Her new sarcastic friend cut in. Rachel had already gotten her 2 cents in, so she just shook her head and continued on. She could have sworn that the long hallway they were after couldn't have been more than a few dozen feet away. But damn, did crouching forward in the darkness one step at a time make it feel like an eternity. Even worse was the eerie silence. It made every noise terrifyingly loud. Every time her shoe caught on a board or her shoulder bumped into a doorframe, Rachel froze, her breathing turning ragged and sweat beading on her forehead while she strove to listen to her surroundings, listening for any sound, any sign that she might be near, might have heard. Adding to her frustration was how perfectly silent Rachel's companion was. Twice, Rachel began to doubt that this mysterious helper was behind her. But each time she paused to peer into the inky gloom behind her, she would hear, "Keep moving," or "I'm right here." Seeing no point in arguing, the blonde just shook her head and crept along. After what felt like a millennia of measured steps and pounding heartbeats, Rachel finally found it. The hallway. Now she just had to hope that their hunch was right, and this was the best way downstairs. She knew that a long hallway topped the flight of the stairs she had run up whenever she snuck up behind the blonde shortly after entering. But It was so hard to see. So hard to know that this was the right way to go. But any action was better than hiding in a dark room, not knowing if she had backed into a dead end. Besides, if all else failed, running had been working pretty well earlier. Rachel decided that there were worse plan Bs. Her mind made up, Rachel went to step into the hallway and paused. She could just faintly hear something. The long hallways and unfamiliar layout of this dilapidated office building made it difficult to identify the noise, and nearly impossible to actually pinpoint. "Did you hear that?" Rachel hissed, standing still as a sculpture. "That could be anything. Keep moving, we have to get out," her companion whispered urgently. Undecided, Rachel hesitated for another span of heartbeats, striving to hear more, waiting for something to make up her mind for her. "Come on! We cannot stay here. We have to..." Rachel cut him off with a wave of her hand and a quick hiss. Rachel took one more shallow breath and turned on her heel and began sprinting down the hallway, leaving her newfound friend behind. It was a voice, a cry for help. The same cry that she had first chased into this building. Maybe it wasn't too late to help. It was barely audible, but unmistakable once Rachel came to the realization, and she couldn't ignore it. Someone else had already saved her life in this building. Maybe they weren't the only two people in here. Maybe she could do that for someone else. No one deserved to get left behind here. "Shit!" she cursed, sliding to a stop. Looking behind her, she didn't see any sign of the person that had helped her. Frantically looking around, she tried to spot him through the near blackness. Even a flicker of movement in the faint light beams shining towards the ceiling would be enough. But no. Nothing. Rachel had interrupted him and ran off without a word. They were separated now. He must have continued towards the exit. In her near panic to help this new person, she had forgotten the one that had already helped her. Cursing her lapse in judgment, she considered turning back and rejoining the mystery helper. Just then, a new cry for help rang out. It was definitely getting louder. That meant she was getting closer, right? It still sounded off, though. Distorted almost, like it was echoing down the hallways or maybe reverberating through a door. Her mind made up, Rachel continued her run down the hallway. Help! There it was again. It sounded like it was right around the corner, just a few steps farther up to her right. But something was wrong. It didn't sound right. The blonde's pace stuttered as she rounded the corner. Immediately, Rachel stumbled to a halt. The blood froze in her veins as an icy chill crept through her spine. There, maybe a dozen paces in front of Rachel, was her. A vague shape standing motionless, darker even than the hallway, standing much taller than Rachel and still seeming to hunch. Only one part of her could be seen. Shining faintly past Rachel's shoulder was one beam of light through a crack in the shuttered window. At the edge of the light hung a mask. A ragged sheet of pitch-colored fabric hung loosely from the hunched shape behind it. Two slits for eyes were the only features on the mask. The cloth rustled in rhythm with the raspy breathing coming from her. Rachel saw all of this within the span of a couple racing heartbeats, her brain struggling to comprehend amidst the panic coursing through her blood. Neither side moved in this span. Time felt as frozen as Rachel did. Before Rachel could turn to run or even scream, a noise came from her. A distorted and rasping "help" came from behind the mask hanging loosely. Rachel's eyes widened as she recognized the noise. The same cry for help that had first brought her into the building, and had caused her to abandon her rescuer. A shaky breath slipped out, and Rachel started to tremble. If Rachel was frozen before, now she was truly petrified. It took a lumbering step towards Rachel. Help me. Another step. Only 10 steps away now. Rachel was screaming in her brain, but she still couldn't seem to move. Now 8 steps. Run! Rachel flinched, confused. Run! It was her companion. He had come back. Rachel started to look over her shoulder when he yelled at her, "Move your ass!" Snapping her head back forward to face her, She was only about 4 or 5 steps away and lumbering at Rachel, still calling for help. Finally startled enough to get in gear, Rachel started backpedaling as fast as she could. She was moving, but wasn't exactly in control. After only a few steps, Rachel tripped backwards, falling with her full weight into the shuttered window behind her. With a loud crack, Rachel fell on her rear, dazed in a shower of splintered wood and shattered glass. The yellow light from the street that flooded into the hallway was dazzling, almost blinding. Blinking away the light and the dust, and not to mention the pain, Rachel struggled to refocus. Looking up, she flinched away from an ear-splitting sound, a grating, distorted, high-pitched screech. Hands clasped over her ears and curled up underneath the window, Rachel looked up into the light, just in time to see her jerking away from the light. It didn't leave, though, instead retreating to the edge of the light and looming, staring at Rachel. Before it had a chance to do anything else, Rachel scrambled to her feet, just as her companion started yelling, "What the hell are you doing? Come on!" Continuing to look over her shoulder, Rachel started jogging back down the hallway towards her original destination. Looking over her shoulder while running wasn't exactly good form, but it was better than being snuck up on. Besides, the hallway wasn't too far away. Looking back forward, she thought she caught a flicker of movement in the darkness that must have been her now twice savior rounding the corner. Coming up to the hallway, Rachel slowed to a walk. Rolling her shoulders and shaking out the aches from falling on her butt, she started to think out loud. It just helped to hear anything. Well, at least anything that wasn't a distorted mockery of the human speech. She didn't know if she would ever be able to forget that sound and the fear that wormed its way in. Thanks to her friend, and she decided he counted as a friend now, Rachel had escaped. With his help, she had broken through the paralyzing fear and gotten away. Even better, she had learned something. She had a path towards safety. And that's the end of part 2. I really hope y'all have enjoyed listening to Rachel's story so far. Part 3 hopefully is right around the corner. We're getting into the end game now, and I hope you're all as excited to hear the finale as I am to record it and get it out to y'all. Again, please, any feedback, any comments, greatly appreciated. Like I said in part 1, this is the first time I've done a project like this, and so far I'm thoroughly enjoying it, but who knows, maybe I'll keep going. Thank you so much for listening.